It was supposed to be a fun weekend for 5 friends: Jacob, Sarah, Mark, Rachel, and Chris. They had all been friends since high school and decided to go on a camping trip together to catch up on old times. The plan was to spend a few nights in the woods, roast marshmallows over a campfire, and share ghost stories. Little did they know that their weekend getaway would turn into a nightmare they would never forget. They arrived at the campsite on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the wind. They set up their tents and started a campfire, sharing stories and laughing. As the night wore on, they began to feel uneasy. It was as if someone was watching them from the shadows, but every time they looked, there was nothing there. Sarah suggested they all go to bed, hoping a good night's sleep would ease their nerves. They crawled into their tents, but none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jacob was the first to fall asleep, but he was soon awakened by the sound of twigs snapping outside of his tent. He sat up, listening closely, but the sounds had stopped. Thinking it was just an animal, he went back to sleep. A few hours later, Rachel woke up to the sound of footsteps outside of her tent. She tried to shake it off as just her imagination, but the footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. She heard breathing outside of her tent, heavy and labored. She was too scared to move, so she just lay there, listening as the breathing slowly faded away. In the morning, everyone except Sarah gathered around the campfire, trying to figure out what had happened during the night. They all agreed that they had heard strange noises, but they couldn't explain them. Figuring Sarah woke up earlier than them to investigate. They decided to go for a hike to take their minds off of it. As they walked deeper into the woods, they began to feel like they were being followed. Every time they turned around, there was no one there, but they could feel a presence lurking just out of sight. They decided to turn back, but as they did, they heard a scream in the distance. It was Sarah's voice. They ran towards the sound, but when they got there, she was gone. They searched the woods for hours, calling out her name, but there was no sign of her. They were all terrified, not knowing what had happened to their friend. As night fell, they decided to return to the campsite, hoping that Sarah would find her way back there. But when they arrived, they found that their tents had been torn apart. Their food was scattered everywhere, and their belongings were gone. They realized that someone, or something, had been on their campsite while they were out searching for Sarah. They spent the rest of the night huddled around the campfire, too scared to sleep. They could hear something moving in the woods around them, but they couldn't see anything in the darkness. It was as if they were being stalked by an invisible predator. In the morning, they decided that they had to get out of the woods as soon as possible. They packed up what was left of their belongings and began to make their way back to their car. As they walked, they could hear footsteps behind them, but every time they turned around, there was no one there. They finally made it back to their car, and as they were about to leave, they saw Sarah stumbling out of the woods. She was covered in dirt and scratches, but she was alive. She told them that she had been attacked by something in the woods, but she couldn't remember what it was. All she could recall was a feeling of being dragged and then passing out. The group quickly got Sarah into the car and drove away from the woods as fast as they could. As they drove, they all breathed a sigh of relief, thinking they had made it out alive. But as they approached the edge of the woods, they saw something that made their skin crawl. When the group first laid eyes on the monster, their blood ran cold with fear. It was tall and thin, towering over them with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. Its skin was a sickly pale color, as if it had been deprived of sunlight for years, and it was covered in dirt and leaves. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and they could see the glint of its razor-sharp teeth when it opened its mouth. Its face was obscured by shadows, but they could see that it had no nose, only 2 black holes where its nostrils should be. Its fingers were long and bony, ending in sharp claws that it used to grab hold of Sarah and drag her away. The monster moved with a fluid grace, as if it had been living in the woods for centuries. It was a creature unlike anything they ever saw before, and they were all speechless at what was in front of them. The group slammed on the brakes, and the figure slowly approached the car. As it got closer, they could see that it was covered in dirt and leaves, as if it had been living in the woods for years. It stopped in front of the car and stared at them, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Without warning, it lunged at the car, its long arms reaching through the window. The group screamed as they tried to push it away, but it was too strong. It grabbed hold of Sarah and pulled her out of the car, dragging her back into the woods. As soon as the figure disappeared into the woods with Sarah, the remaining members of the group panicked. Mark and Chris, being the stronger members of the group, immediately ran after to save Sarah, leaving Rachel and Jacob behind. They tried to call for help, but there was no signal. They couldn't just leave their friends behind, so they decided to go after them. As Rachel and Jacob made their way through the woods, they could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. They were scared, but they knew they couldn't just leave Sarah behind. They followed the trail left by the monster, their eyes scanning the dense foliage for any sign of their friend. The path was treacherous, and they had to climb over fallen trees and wade through streams. As they got deeper into the woods, they could feel the presence of the monster lurking around every corner. Their nerves were frayed, and they could hear each other's breathing becoming more and more labored. But they kept going, their determination to rescue Sarah driving them forward. They knew that time was running out, and they had to find her before it was too late. They followed the trail left by the figure, which led them deep into the woods. The path was difficult to navigate, and they had to climb over rocks and crawl through dense vegetation. The farther they went, the more they realized they were in over their heads. As Rachel and Jacob continued their search for Sarah, they stumbled upon Chris lying unconscious on the ground. They could see that he had deep scratches on his arms and face, and they knew that the monster had attacked him. They quickly realized that they had to take him with them if he were going to get out of the woods alive. They hoisted him up between them, struggling with his weight as they continued their search. It wasn't long before they came across Mark, who was impaled on a tree branch. Rachel screamed in horror at the sight, and Jacob had to steady her as they approached. Mark looked almost lifeless, impaled on the tree branch. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Blood trickled from the wound on his side, staining his clothes and the bark of the tree. He was pale and clammy, and it was clear that he was close to death. The sight of him was gruesome, and Rachel and Jacob knew that they had to continue their search for Sarah, but they couldn't shake the feeling of guilt and horror at leaving Mark behind in such a terrible state. As Rachel and Jacob continued their trek through the woods, carrying Chris between them, they noticed that his breathing had become shallower and more erratic. They stopped and checked his pulse, but there was nothing. Chris had died, and there was nothing they could do to bring him back. They were devastated by the loss of yet another member of their group, and they struggled to come to terms with the fact that they had been unable to save him. They carefully laid him on the ground and took a moment to say a prayer to him before continuing their mission to find Sarah. The weight of their loss hung heavy on their hearts, and they knew that their chances of survival were dwindling with each passing moment. The remaining members of the group were terrified and on the brink of giving up, but they knew they had to keep going. As Rachel and Jacob searched desperately for Sarah, their fears and anxiety continued to rise. But as they emerged from the dense forest, their worst fears were confirmed. There was Sarah, lying on the ground, half-eaten and mutilated beyond recognition. The sight was so gruesome and horrifying that Rachel couldn't even bear to look. The monster had clearly tortured Sarah, and its brutality was evident in every inch of her broken body. Her limbs were twisted in unnatural ways, and her face was contorted in a permanent expression of agony. Blood had soaked into the ground around her, and it was clear that she had suffered greatly before finally succumbing to her wounds. Jacob and Rachel were filled with a sense of profound loss and grief, knowing that they had failed to save their friends in time. As Rachel and Jacob mourned the loss of their friend Sarah, they suddenly heard a rustling in the bushes. The monster was back, and it was clear that it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Without hesitation, Jacob and Rachel took off running, their hearts pounding in their chests as they raced through the dense forest. The monster was hot on their heels, its roar echoing through the trees as it chased them relentlessly. Rachel and Jacob knew that they had to keep moving, and they pushed themselves to the limit, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as they sprinted through the woods. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they burst through the trees and saw their car in the distance. Adrenaline surged through their bodies as they sprinted towards it, knowing that their only chance of survival lay in reaching it before the monster caught up. They jumped in the car, fumbling with the keys as they struggled to start the engine. The monster was almost upon them, its screeching wails ringing in their ears as they frantically tried to get the car started. Finally, with a roar of the engine, the car sprang to life, and Rachel and Jacob peeled out of the clearing, the monster's claws scraping the side of the car. As they sped away, they knew that they had narrowly escaped with their lives, and they silently mourned the loss of their friends as they headed back home, forever haunted by the memories of their horrific camping trip. The group was devastated. They had lost 3 of their friends and barely escaped with their own lives. As they made their way back to civilization, they knew that they would never be the same. They had experienced something that would haunt them forever. After the incident, the authorities were called, but they found no evidence of what had happened to the group. The woods remained untouched, and people were warned to stay away from the area. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear footsteps in the woods and whispers of a creature that has been stalking the woods. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.